going to get started. We've got our final study session with the Planning Commission, and we're going to be taking a look at the final draft of the comp plan and the transportation master plan. And this is an opportunity for our consultants and staff to have a conversation with us about the month of open public comment and the input that you got, some of the changes that have been made between the plan that we saw prior and this plan. This plan shows up on Monday for the Planning Commission, and it shows up on next Tuesday for the City Council. So this is not an opportunity tonight to do any wholesale changes or any massive revisions. If we see typos or mispunctuation, something like that, just let staff know offline. We're not gonna go through all of that here tonight at all. It's over 500 pages, and I imagine you missed something. There might be a typo. So we're not gonna go through any of those tonight. We will have an opportunity to have kind of a conversation about it, but I think we all need to be very cognizant of the fact that we have said for well over a month that this is the draft plan, and this is the plan that will come before council and planning. If there are major substantive changes that just absolutely have to be made, and there's a large consensus from the bodies, then those will probably be made at the dais as opposed to in this room. We just cannot.
You don't want to talk about it all night?
No, we've talked about it for 2 years. Let's get her done.
Jerry wants to talk about it.
We will go ahead. Who's going to start off? Mark, did you want to start off?
Yeah, maybe just a couple of quick comments here. First of all, I appreciate everybody being here tonight. Looks like we got a full room. We've been on one heck of a journey. So as the mayor said, next week is deliberation for Planning Commission and the City Council. I have shared this before, but my hope had always been that we would put in place together a framework for us to act on in the future. One for our comp plan, and one for our transportation master plan. I think the conversation that we've had here with the leadership team has been great. I think the public conversation has been pretty stellar as well. And I do look forward to the conversation here tonight to talk about our final draft. Again, this plan will never be perfect. I don't care how much time we spend on it, but I think what we've done here is put in place here, certainly the ordinance of last week, was an opportunity for us to obviously acknowledge the fact that we intend on a regular basis to kind of update this, perhaps on an annual basis, but at a minimum, we need to be doing this every 5 to 6 years. For both the comp plan and the transportation master plan. I also love Brett Keith's analogy of thinking of this as a mobile. And so I kind of view this as we're starting that mobile, and we got a couple of pieces we're about ready to kind of hang. And over time, I do look forward to talking about all sorts of key policy issues here that councils of the future can kind of add to the mobile. And I think that's how I view this. It's a framework for us to kind of identify those issues and kind of act on that. So maybe with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen to kind of kick us off here.
All right, thanks Mark, and good evening members of the City Council and Planning Commission. As the Mayor mentioned, this is our final joint leadership study session, so it feels like an amazing accomplishment to be at this place. But I would just really like to emphasize, when we started this process back in March of 2008, we really were asking our community to renew their emotional connection to this city and really start to dream with us about the next 20 years. Obviously, this framework is in large part about the needs of the city, but it also recognizes in many, many ways the need for partnerships to help deliver that vision and deliver on those goals, those policies. There's obviously a role to play beyond just this building, these two bodies. There are many roles to be played. So I want to also emphasize that I think you probably have had a chance to look at the engagement appendix. I think this is something for you and the city to be very proud of in terms of the amount of engagement. It is incredible the generosity of time that we found in the community, and I think it really does speak volumes. Of course, it is also a testament to the engagement and the level of passion and love for the city with how many public comments we received. I think I've shared with you in the past that the city of Centennial that just went through their comprehensive planning process received 6 comments as part of their plan. We had over 100 submissions and hundreds of comments. I know there's 2 ways to look at that, like, well, we must have gotten everything, right? So we didn't get a lot of comments, but I think it is truly a testament to the level of engagement that we had along the way. So this evening, obviously puts us in phase 5 of the project, which is our final phase. We're looking at final plans. You're considering both recommendation and adoption next week. As we dig into the start this evening, we're going to start with the comprehensive plan, move to the transportation master plan, and on tonight's agenda, we're going to discuss those major comments and sort of go section by section. We'll also highlight any items for continued or further discussion and next steps. We'll do that with both plans. I think the emphasis that Mark put on this being a framework, it does really become a set of living documents. There always is going to be room for improvement, and we're always striving to be the best possible version of ourselves and really highlight clearly the things that we're looking for as we sit around those regional tables, as well as pursuing opportunities for future funding and the transportation side. So I think that it does really speak to that framework piece. So with that, let's dig into the comprehensive plan, so I'll turn it over to Gary.
All right. Good evening, everyone. So they say consultants learn learn one thing from every project, and my takeaway, I think Keith would agree, is never agree to a 30-day public period and 1 week to process all those comments. That was intense, but it was all good, and seriously, with that volume of comments, one thing that impressed me was there was nothing very negative and really in your face. It was very, very constructive comments. Certainly not everybody agreeing with everything, and people pointing out things that they did like in the plan. We don't always get that, so really appreciated that. Let's see, just to recap once again on the comprehensive plan side of the various pieces, with the transportation section being the link, of course, to the TMP. So all those colored sections that are the topic areas. But starting with the introduction, so we have a series of slides. On each section we'll kind of recap what some of the major comments were and then what has changed. In the comprehensive plan document, we did yellow highlighting to point out where we had made changes. Flipping through that again the last few days, we've made a fair amount of changes. We didn't change, in response to every single comment that came in, as we've always discussed. It was in the context of everything we've talked about and heard over the last 18 months. So, but you can see where we made changes. In the introduction, which the introduction is those first few pages, plus there's the population projections. It ultimately gets into the division and goals recap from last year. But one thing that we changed there or added was put some additional verbiage about the population projections. Big caveat there that that is what could happen in Littleton. That is certainly what happens in other communities of this size and of this level of build out. Cities do absorb that amount of population, but that's not necessarily what's going to happen. In this case, we know that you're about to head into a zoning discussion, which is going to get into all those discussions of densities and uses and those types of things. So the population projection is based on trend and recent activity in the area. So it will play out based on what the zoning discussion leads to in terms of what can happen on those remaining vacant properties and what are the possibilities on the redevelopment side and infill. So I seriously don't expect 15,000 additional residents in Littleton, knowing everything I know about this community, but I think somewhere in between, and as we've talked about in the past, just the persons per household factor is a key to how many people can live in even just the existing housing units. There were some recent headlines that for the first time in 15 or so years, 15, 20 years, there's a slight uptick across the nation, so in broad brush, of persons per household when it's been down for a number of years, so that was the main thing we changed in the introduction.
Excuse me, can I just ask that you point out where it changed because the printed copies don't have highlights or anything?
Doesn't have the highlights. Okay, it's on the page, I believe, right before the projection chart.
Yeah, so it's on page 5.
Thank you.
It's under that final paragraph in the bottom line.
So I believe, and I guess that's from reproduction, but the online version should have the highlights. If you look at the,
And that is available on envisionbulletin.org.
and really that was, in all these sections, there was wordsmithing based on comments, but that was the really major change in this section, not too much change in the introduction. Let's see. On the vision and goals and values, we probably should have framed that better, but those were adopted by council last year, so those weren't really intended to be open for discussion. Those were already adopted, so we did get some comments on those, but did not make any changes to the vision guiding principles. And we did have a suggestion from somebody off of this group to have the entire vision report that council adopted last year in December, which was about 16 pages or so, as an appendix. So that's now in the document, not just referenced. So I guess, Mayor, that's kind of the approach we'll take, is we'll just, a section at a time, we'll point out those highlights and then open for discussion.
Yeah, it would help if you announce the page, then you're gonna be on things.
Yes.
All right, then there's a few pages, let's see, we're on the existing city portion, which is before that.
The appendix. It's in the appendix now. Okay, so page 7.
Starting at page 7, the full existing city data book that we did earlier this year is an appendix. So that whole document is in the back. These pages, a few pages here, starting at page 7, is just some highlights, and especially back in the appendix, we did make changes based on the comments that we had gotten back at that time on the data book. So you'll see changes in that appendix as well. And there it cuts across a variety of the topics. As you haven't seen that document probably in a while, but that was the one that had big number statistics called out on the different topics with some discussion. So I don't think it was so much changing numbers, it was more about that commentary that went with the numbers. So nothing that really stood out big to me there. Some of it was just facts and figures. The post office was designated as a historic property in the meantime this year. So just some updates like that. And then, let's see, this is on page 9, I believe, or that's 7 also.
Yeah, so they start on page 7.
Yeah, so 7 and 8 is new since the last draft you saw, those graphics there. We had, those that were here last time, remember that we had a slide that kind of went from, okay, here's what somebody said 12, 18 months ago in a public discussion. Here's how that fed into the vision guiding principles. And now how that is fed through in the comprehensive plan to goals, policies, actions. So we gave examples of that for each of the 5 guiding principles. And then on page 9, there's a table there that's also new since last go-round. And that table, we took the DRCOG Metro Vision document, which covers a lot of territory, of course, similar to a comprehensive plan, economy, environment, housing, parks, all those topics. We've made a connection between your comprehensive plan and the DRCOG policies and priorities. So that's what that page is about, page 9 and 10. So that is new to the document. And then those next several pages is, again, just a recap of the vision guiding principles from December 2018. So then, starting on page 15, now we're getting to the topic sections. All right. As we go, I wanted to point out there's only a handful of examples, but this goes back to your that detailed meeting we had where we went through all the sections last time. There were a few items where it was a complete deletion of an item. I'll call those out as we go. But otherwise, in land use community character, there was some concern about the term cluster development. It's gone. And as I've mentioned to some people tonight, it's gonna come back in the zoning discussion because it's part of the community character approach. I know some people are uncomfortable with that, but that'll be part of the conversation. And then as all those conversations for zoning, where does Littleton wanna be?
And Kath, is that what you and I were talking about over the past, okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
There's been a lot of discussion about corridor mixed use. I'll circle back to that. We put some additional verbiage in there and some wordsmithing of that discussion. In general, that third point here on the slide, and this isn't just Littleton, this is in a lot of comprehensive plan processes. Some of the comments were definitely jumping into that zoning discussion that's gonna happen next year. The comprehensive plan does not get to that level of detail of densities and including those pie charts. We were asked to put more of the pie charts throughout the section in those map category descriptions. Those are just examples. I mentioned in a previous meeting, in the zoning process, our guys are gonna model your zoning districts. They're gonna look at all the existing lots, what's on the ground, because when you are doing zoning, the last thing you wanna do is create a lot of nonconformities. So they've gotta understand what's the existing distribution of lot sizes, what are the current footprints of homes and businesses, how much of lots are covered by impervious cover, and how much is open space, those three pieces of the pie. That's a zoning matter, and how those sizes of the pie slices end up will come through the zoning process, but we put more of the pies as generic examples of what suburban typically that distribution is. There are no changes to the map since last time. I will say we did add more discussion under corridor mixed use and took out the word cluster development, but did put a graphic in there of what the concept is there. So I think those are the main things. On the deletion side, I mentioned the cluster development language going away. You recall that there was a policy in this section talking about the land use around school campuses. I think there was discomfort with this group last time. Gone, that statement is gone.
Can you point some of those things out, like what statement has gone, what was it? And
I don't have that last draft, it was in the last draft. I believe there is a. I know there's discussion of schools, I'm sorry, council member didn't come prepared to kind of make the connection back to the previous draft, but we generalized one of the statements that had reference to schools, where it was previously much more about the land use around school campuses. That language is gone.
that's fine. It's fine. You guys take advantage of it, keep going.
Cluster development, page 19, towards the bottom, you introduced a new section that shows some various drawings. Where'd that come from, and why was it included here?
Sure. This is really setting up for the zoning discussion that Brett is going to have with everybody. One of the concepts that we've discussed is to try and get away from planned development, the way planned development is typically done in zoning. That it's, a lot of things are on the table and it's a give and take, and there sometimes is less predictability, sometimes that process drags out. We try to build some of the benefits of doing a planned development approach into the zoning ordinance, but with standards attached to it, so that there's more predictability of if somebody does something that's not a standard subdivision layout, here's some of the criteria. And what this language is talking about is if you allow some alternative layouts of a subdivision that gets into smaller lots, the open space automatically increases. So that's the trade-off of, it could be the same number of homes, same number of lots, but they're smaller and they're concentrated typically in the middle of the lot so that you're providing a greater buffer if there are other homes nearby that are larger lot, more traditional layout of subdivision. So it's a way to, and some of the language we use here is sometimes it's constrained sites. When you're getting to be a built-out city and you're down to your last remaining sites, sometimes it's floodplain, topography, whatever that constrains the site. If you can only do a standard subdivision layout, it may not be a viable use of that property. But if you have some flexibility to do some other lot sizes, but then increase open space and increase buffering. So, going on this, but what I'm trying to plant the seed here is for a zoning conversation to come in much more detail.
Do you see that flexibility happening in other zoning districts when we get going with the zoning?
It's typically in the suburban range because the lots are large enough.
Okay.
When you get down to your auto-oriented, for example, those tend to be smaller lot sizes, and that's the reason that garages get pushed out front. There's less setback. There's just not the openness because it is a smaller lot size type of development. So that's why that option doesn't really work. And just one more connection, what I was talking about modeling the zoning districts. The first thing Brett and our team does is they look at all the encumbrances that fall on lots, which means, is there any right-of-way dedication, easements, drainage requirements, sidewalks, anything that takes away from the buildable area of the lot? That's what really determines what do I have to work with. And if you do that across an entire site, because we often see zoning ordinances that say the density in this zoning district is 8 units per acre or whatever, you can never get there because all these things are being taken away, easements, whatever, right-of-way dedication, that you'll never get to the 8. So, as you can see, very quickly we're getting into a nitty-gritty zoning density discussion. Comprehensive plan is trying to stay at a broader level but plant the seed. And I will probably say 12 times tonight that idea of that because you're going to be on a cycle of updating the plan regularly, I absolutely see this plan being updated at the end of your zoning process. Because the zoning process is going to get into these conversations that a lot of people want to have now. And the implications of those conversations can feed back into the plan.
Well, thanks for adding the graphic, because I really do think that it helps to clarify, because that's part of the conversation I've had with Kathleen over the last couple of months.
Sure.
Exactly what is it?
Yeah, and I know the term cluster and increased density scares people. It's the same number of lots, or sometimes we build in an incentive that if you do the cluster option, you might get an additional lot, but there's all that open space in exchange.
Thanks.
Just to clarify, so what the intent of this image is to say any of these can exist within a suburban residential?
Which page are you?
Page 19.
Yeah, so any of these, the reason these pictures are here is to say any of these combinations could exist within a suburban residential. Is that why you have this image here?
Based on the zoning discussion and outcomes next year, this is an example of how that could play, but it's not.
Any of those are examples of how it could play.
Examples.
Any of these can exist. So maybe just put a little note underneath of what this picture is supposed to represent.
Sorry, this is part of the draft.
I'm sorry? We'll find it.
Yeah, and I know the highlighting is gone, but the start of that second sentence is that character-based zoning and development standards can ... So that's what we're doing when I say planting the seed. The comprehensive plan is not saying this is the law of the land or this is the way it will be. It's saying that it's setting up for that discussion.
You could say illustrative examples below the 3 pictures.
Okay.
Question.
Becky.
So you mentioned about aging community, and so we don't need to have certain things as much because we're aging. Well, I'm aging faster than other people, at least in numbers. But some of us aren't going to be here very long. because we're aging. And I could fall over any second here. So if I get replaced, I'm more likely to be replaced by a younger person who's gonna have a whole bunch of kids, or a couple of kids, or whatever. So we might become more dense. I would expect us to become more dense as we see the inevitable happen to an aging community.
Not necessarily. If a bunch of people have modified their homes to put in wheelchair ramps and renovated their bathrooms, and those homes become attractive to the next senior buyer.
We have an incredible school system that attracts people. And some young people anyway, have money, or families lend them money to help them with a down payment to have a reasonable loan. So I'm just, not wanting to assume that we just are gonna age.
And that's,
Peggy's done.
Yeah.
So when I was looking through the suburban residential, including the attached and the multifamily, and the auto-oriented residential and the attached and the multifamily, all of them allow PDs except for the auto-oriented residential, and I was curious about that.
sure. Planned development is defined today the way it typically is in most cities and zoning. That use of the term, when you get into the zoning discussion, is gonna be a different definition. It's a development option. Trying to encourage people, especially in constrained areas, to not do a standard subdivision layout, to go to other types of designs. And you have those in Littleton. There are great examples right off of Windermere of clustered housing with open space around them. So it's on the ground. But as I mentioned to Mark, when you get into areas that are auto-oriented, they tend to be smaller lots, so that flexibility just isn't there. So it's not so much the use of planned development as you think of it today. It's gonna be how we use the planned development term in character zoning. We're trying to get away from that typical planned development option where it's, okay, let's negotiate what happens on the site.
Okay, so you're not anticipating an audit-oriented needing of plan development?
Typically it doesn't, but as I say, it's gonna depend on that modeling of the districts, the lot sizes, what's possible in those districts.
Thank you.
All right, housing and neighborhoods,
Page.
Begins on page 45.
Great advancement, I like that a lot.
I second that.
all right, in this section, the challenge here was, a big part of this section of the plan was to tie in housing study results. We got very creative with other ways to say affordable, so there's not so many references to affordable, but the housing study was about affordable housing, so that's why there were so many references to affordable. We've reworked a lot of those. The other thing that was deleted was, you'll recall there was a policy statement that very specifically called out Walhurst and Meadowwood Village, the manufactured home communities. The direction was generalize it, so we've done that, and once again, don't have that specific reference, but I know there is an action item about housing variety, without calling those out specifically. The final one, as a deletion in this section, there was a policy that talked about, interestingly worded statement that talked about people being priced out of their area. I know there's a lot of discomfort with that, gone, so that was the other one that went away, and that was a policy statement. All right, on the overall section, again, not focusing so much on the affordability terminology perhaps, but that is certainly the focus of the housing study. There was also discussion about, things that the city can control or can accomplish. I meant to say at the beginning of this discussion, and I've mentioned this in earlier meetings, these comprehensive plans across the country, they get adopted by city councils typically, or a county group of elected officials. But they're really meant to be a plan for the community, and that's why there's all those boxes of partners in each section. So all the action items in this plan aren't meant to be done by the city necessarily. The seed is planted for somebody to pick up the ball, and because it's a 20-year plan, that ball may not be picked up for 15 years. And some of them, I guarantee you, will not be done in 20 years. They'll continue to be seeds. But so that was one of the items we did change some wording based on that concern, but there are items in this section in particular dealing with housing where you have various partners, nonprofits, housing authority, foundations that get into housing, and so there's other players that can get into that. In each section, under the regulatory actions, we have typically a list of bullet items of things that are up for consideration when you get into the zoning process next year. We added a few items to that list based on some of the comments. And there was a suggestion, which we typically do in comp plans, to have an action item that calls out homeowner associations. You know, always trying to have a good relationship and networking when you have HOAs in your community. Just that channel of communication, and I think the way we worded it was to also be sensitive to the neighborhoods that don't have that structure or that vehicle for communication.
I think you have also you slipped in, you're more sensitive to existing housing. You slipped in a few words here and there, protection of existing homes, enhancement of existing housing and neighborhoods, whereas previous draft you as more, new housing, clustered housing, whatever. But not now. There's more and more emphasis on existing housing and improving what we have already.
Yes.
Whether it be eventually scraping off or adding on to or keeping as is, historic references, etc. So that's a really good improvement over the previous draft.
There is one item I'd like to take to council for consideration. I know you said substantive changes you wanted on the dais, but I really think the purpose of the study session is to talk about some of these so that we aren't trying to address them at the dais. The action H and N5, which is examine the potential for acquiring vacant land for future affordable mixed income housing using a land banking model. So I'd like to strike this one. I don't think we are a city of this size to be able to support buying land for housing. These are things that, yes, you hear about in Aurora and Denver, but they're in a very different situation than we are in. And plus, we have many other tools and actions that we've identified, including the low-income housing tax credit, working with SHMO and others. So I just don't see this as being really viable for a city of our size or our resources. So I'd like to strike this from here.
I agree.
Well, I was just gonna say, just to go back to the comment you made before, that's not just saying the city will do it, it's saying it could be with partners too. So it could be SHMO or other groups.
I think the only response is it's in the housing study, it's among your array of options and tools. It's we added a term to the glossary in the back of the document, land banking, land trusts. Those are the folks that typically do this, nonprofits, and they hold, just like with environmental conservation or green space conservation, there's trusts that will hold land until it goes to the actual use. So it certainly can be struck, but it's not just about the city.
It's reading right now that it is about the city, but even if it is for other entities, to your point, if it's in the housing study, that's exactly what Action H&N2 does, is look at the housing study and bring forward what is viable. So I still stand firm that I just don't think we're in a position to make this action adopt it as part of our comprehensive plan.
Carol?
I would like to go back to the concept that Gary just said, that this is seeds, possibilities that might happen in 15, 20 years. And so I would like to keep it as a possibility. I don't see any purpose of striking this one possibility and leaving all the other possibilities.
I agree.
And it doesn't say we have to, it just says examine potential, we can say, okay, there's no potential.
Well, I think there's opportunity when you look at some of the vacant properties we have right now, even though they're privately owned, that there's a lot of that are at risk. And if there was an opportunity to purchase, you see a number of cities have been able to do that very successfully and do some really amazing things with that. It takes some money and it takes some time, but I think leaving it as an option is important for us. Peggy?
Well, of course, it doesn't matter, I'm not gonna be on council, but we can do things that aren't stated in this if they come before us, right? I mean, we've been doing things in the last 12 years that weren't in documents necessarily like this, so
I think it's.
I wouldn't like to make this a main stated thing, but that's not precluding
I kind of feel that this is premature to, this is a pretty significant action and position that we're taking, and this is the first time that, it's really been brought forward, so I just feel like, we haven't heard this come forward from citizens in other discussions that we've had, so again, I just don't see that this is viable for the city of Littleton.
Okay. Planning, any thoughts?
Well, it says examine the potential, as you say. Doesn't mean we're gonna do it. There's a possibility it could happen down the road. I say leave it in.
Bruce?
Yeah, outlining these types of things as concepts in this document might germinate a seed down the road for a given parcel or project. If you don't talk about it, there's a pretty good chance nothing will ever come of it. So even having it in here as a concept, to me, I think is a good idea because, it may never get acted upon, but on the other hand, talking about it doesn't degrade anything.
Anybody else? Okay. I think we've got consensus to keep it in at this point.
I have a question on the housing and neighborhoods. It's a different one.
Where are you?
On page 47.
Okay, thanks.
It's one of the yellow highlights. It's under the H&N 11. Looks like it's the sixth one down. So adding in transit orient development, and it's also brought up later on on page 75. It just makes me think of when we did the mineral framework, how our community reacted so didn't want the transit orient development. How do you see this fitting in with our community characteristics? Where would that fall into, or how do we make this consistent with using community character?
Transit-oriented development is a widely used term. It tends to mean things that are more toward the urban end of the spectrum in terms of smaller footprints, so it's walkable, not surface parking, typically garage parking, to get more activity around a transit station. Now, since the day we walked into Littleton 18 months ago, I've heard the term Littleton-style TOD, transit-oriented development. Again, this is planting one of those seeds for the zoning conversation of with 2 light rail stations in Littleton and some expressed desire, including in the 30-day comments, to have TOD. Where is our TOD in Littleton? To have that conversation and explore best practices for how that might work in Littleton. So that's the purpose of introducing it.
Does it fit into community character though? I mean, would we
It
be
does,
creating
it does.
something new for that?
No, as I say, it's typically in the urban end of the spectrum. If you're getting into surface lots, you're getting into auto-urban character, spreading out the footprint. And there certainly are examples of that. There are light rail stations that have big parking lots and not too much else activity around them. So I think what you could end up with, as in some of our character categories in the land use section, is mixed character. You're gonna have different character elements. You might have, go to Highlands Ranch, and we have a commercial mixed-use development that has that kind of core area where you might wanna get out of the car and spend a little time, but otherwise, it's a pretty typical suburban development with a lot of parking and drive-up stores. So, you know, you could end up with that. So, short answer to your question, it does fit into the character spectrum, but it's whether you're gonna draw from different pieces in terms of surface parking and a little bit of urban flavor, not the full urban that, you know, typical TOD in some areas ends up being.
Taking into account the reaction the community gave
Absolutely.
with Mineral, it'd be like you said, Littleton style.
Yes, and as I say, you know, I'm not doing my job if I don't say, when you have 2 transit stations in your community, there needs to be something oriented to those sites, whatever it is, but certainly not turn away from it as Aspen Grove did, examples like that, so.
Mark?
Gary, you might want to comment on this, but when I read that, I was thinking not only just light rail, but I think the opportunity for BRT along Broadway. You know, I kind of raised that as an example of what the city may want to consider here. And I think Keith Borsheim has commented on that in the past. I think our Keith Reisker has also commented on that and worked with RTD. So to me, that's probably another example. Is that fair to say?
Yes, and in that case, that's a good example where, yeah, you might not get, again, to that urban side of the spectrum because of the nature of the properties, the shallowness of properties along Broadway, but the potential is there. And we tied it to some of those land use categories that are nearby, like the residential mix. That's an area of Littleton that, hey, if there was BRT and the opportunity to do mixed housing types, there's the best of both worlds.
So it has the flexibility. Yeah, thanks.
Peggy?
So I'd like to back up to action H and N9, a little higher up the page. The word ensure is bothersome to me. Ensure homeowners, tenants, and landlords are aware of resources available through various state and federal programs, etc. So if somebody doesn't know, and we have this in here, aren't we vulnerable to something? Some legal thing? Because we said we're gonna ensure essentially that everybody knows. Now maybe we can publicize or promote or do something or other, but ensure, I mean, I know it's not a marriage vow, but it's still pretty powerful.
I think that's a good potential amendment when it comes down to the final action next week.
So you'd like me to think of the word?
Next.
We'll skip transportation, so we'll dig in deeper on that one. Don't you think?
Yeah, and the transportation content, which is new since last time, is kind of highlights from the TMP pulled into the comprehensive plan document to make that link. So infrastructure and services, page 57. Again, nothing, no major deletions in this section, a lot of wordsmithing in response to comments. And I should say in general, we didn't subtract too much stuff from the content you saw a month or more ago. It was mainly rewording and adding, so not too much went away. In this section, the term resiliency was in there, so there was some comment about how to frame the discussion about that. One person mentioned, or several people, that flooding is not just from natural waterways, of course, that over time as areas develop, the built environment can affect flooding risk. So there's a reference to that. The role of the faith community, including in the partners box, we've added a reference there because we did hear that in our discussions last year, ways that your religious community gets involved in helping folks in a variety of ways, but including after disaster situations. And then again, just additional partners that were suggested for that partner box in this section. And I know it's for those that have the hard copies, you can't see it, but in the online version where we added to the partner boxes, those are also in yellow text. So you'll see those highlights.
I'm glad you added the Southeast
The new name.
Storm Authority.
One item that I have on here is INS 17, and I'll bring it forward as an amendment next week. We're just combining the Bemis Library and the museum into one action here, and I do think they warrant their own standalone. So I'll propose an amendment to just have them each be a separate action item.
Next.
Bruce? Quick question. There's a reference in here to well-maintained water, wastewater, and storm drainage infrastructure that serves the needs. We don't really get into the Milton Englewood wastewater treatment plant. And I guess I'm wondering if there should be more. I mean, it's an element of, you know, city services. I'm not sure, you know, at some point, if you've got population growth and so forth and so on, thinking about what needs to happen there. Don't know if and when capacity changes. And I know we had issues with disinfectant types of processes that may change as regulations change and so forth and so on. So I don't know if that's something that requires a little bit more verbiage.
Couple of thoughts there, Bruce. In the existing city data book, that's one of the most extensively discussed items is the partnership. And we also have it in the partners box. There's the South Platte Water Renewal Partners. In some of our earlier drafts, when we kind of called out that the city wasn't in a direct operational role, there was some pushback on that of, oh yeah, we are, through the partnership with another city. So we were trying to kind of stay away from those specific references, but we've called it out among the partners that that's how it gets done. But it's discussed it'll be in the appendix now, but in the existing city, that relationship is discussed pretty extensively.
And that's appendix 3, is the existing city data book.
Thanks, Bruce.
So many hours.
Got it memorized.
So economy and tax base, which begins on page 61. Oh,
Sorry,
yes.
Catherine, I can't help myself here, but I think Bruce's point, this is actually, infrastructure is a very typical element of a comp plan. And I think I see us having the discussion here in the next couple of years through Keith Reister's work in Public Works of actually hanging another piece of the mobile on our comp plan when we kind of flesh out a master plan for all our utilities. At this point in time, we don't really have that. And so that's an opportunity for us to take the long view of, say, sanitary sewer and how that matches up with growth and development over the next several decades. So it's a very typical element. We're just not quite ready to add that piece.
As predicted, our appendices are growing and they will continue to grow, which is good.
But there is an action 13 that references doing the master plans and maintaining them, so.
Thank you.
Flush, he said flush.
Sewer plans are just too chatty. They're just too easy.
All right, economy and tax base, no major deletions in this section. There was some comment about bringing out local business more. I think you'll see more of those references. I think there's also more references to small business. We kind of heard both sides of that issue when we had referenced small business in some earlier drafts. There was some discussion about keeping it more general. And let's see, there was an item in there about, and this gets into partly workforce skills and training, but just in general, being a community that supports ongoing learning, lifelong learning and education. So there was some rewording there, I believe. And then the section we're about to get into, of course, there's much more discussion now of arts and culture. So we had comments about making that connection to the economy, of course, and the tourism aspect and how that draws people and some business activity, creative business activity to Littleton. So
I can, just a question on that. I don't see it looks like goal ET5 is the one that talks about the lifelong learning. I don't see that there were any changes made there. Is that the one? Or-
Oh, as far as the wording,
Yeah, I thought you just said that you had made some changes to that based on our last.
There was, I
Somewhere
think,
else.
policy 10 is what I think he's referring to.
but actually, let's see, policy 10. Right, yeah, 10 is where the changes happened.
Okay.
Right. Thank you.
The only question I had on the key issues with the addition of the word significant for Class A office development, I know we have one Class A building, but what is significant? Is adding a second one doubling it significant? Is it, 100 acres? What does that mean?
Undefined purposely, but feeding into the economic development plan that's called for in this section, that to get a read on that of, can Littleton get much more than one or two Class A buildings? Is that about it? So significant kind of purposely left undefined of, can you get to 10 buildings? Can you get a cluster office development? Who knows?
So more than one.
And I think the comment was, without that, can we attract one building? Was that, what are we talking about? One or two?
Yeah.
And I'll just point out, area faith community was added to the partners box in this section as well.
We're on page 65.
So, you'll recall, I think in the last meeting of this group, when we went through the document in detail, but also through the comments, the historic constituency and the arts and culture constituency have been heard from.
I think they have a paid consultant here, hammering you guys.
So, but the first step was, how do we rename this section without it turning into half a page? So I want to thank Councilmember Elrod for coming up with a great acronym, HART, H-A-R-T.
It came after that Peter, what's his last name?
Kageyama.
Kageyama's
So
presentation.
we have a rename section, and that's really the gist of what changed in this section. A lot more call out and discussion of arts and culture, along with recreation. I think that was the feedback in general, was there was much more of a recreation, parks and trails emphasis. Historic preservation has also been given more emphasis, and we got a very specific list of comments from the South Suburban District, just some wording, some facts and figures, so very helpful there, made those changes. So I think that's really the kind of the highlights of what changed here.
Comment, legacy of past planning on page 65. Was there no planning before 1950 in Littleton? Or nothing you can document?
Significant past, but no. I mean, it's really the documents that we assembled and received from staff and others for this process, so and that's how some of these were added, is, oh, by the way, here's another one, so, it's really the more recent history, I guess you could say, not all the way
That
back.
plan was done in 2018,
Yeah.
but it was for 1950 and 60 architecture.
That was the title.
That's the mid-century.
Yeah. So the plan was done in 2018, but it was for mid-century.
Yeah, so it actually needs to move on the list, because it's not chronological. It's not chronological.
Well, is it supposed to be, because it's all, they're
None
all
of
on
them
it.
none of them are.
They are.
Yeah, we didn't try to put them in any order for us.
Saw the end in 2019.
Make them alphabetical.
Alphabetical by year.
Well, is there an historian that could, add a couple items in the next week? Probably not, but.
For what end?
Which ones?
Oh, just, what happened in 1928, planning-wise, in the city of Littleton?
They had the flu, they were worried about the flu.
Paved the streets for the first time in 1918.
This is a planning document, not a history.
There's a lot more history in here.
Next.
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 That's a real conversation killer, Mark.
Environment, and then it starts on page 71.
All right, environment did have a couple of deletions. One was in the previous introduction. There was a reference to environmental systems and ecological functions that are beyond the control or influence of just one city. Of course, that wording does not fit very well with folks in the environmental world, that we all have a role to play individually, communities, neighborhoods, so took that wording out. And the other one, you recall our discussion of view protection, so those references have gone away. So that had shown up in this section.
Yep.
All right, so a variety of comments, of course, on the screen about, some very specific things in the environmental arena. We did reference a number of those. Trash and recycling. Some people made that comment in terms of wear and tear on roadways and how of course, Littleton does trash with multiple providers, but we were trying to stick to the environmental aspect of more opportunity to recycle in the community, so stuck to it in that way. By the way, of course, this was the section where this group last time said the goal statements especially were wishy-washy, so hopefully they come across stronger and showing the city's leadership on this one, the community as well. All right, special areas design. Yes, sir.
73, you talk about LID, low impact development strategies. Is there an official federal agency for that, or is there a list? Give me some examples of LIDs.
And it is in the glossary, that term.
Didn't see it.
But it's promoted by, you name it, councils of governments, DRCOG, federal agencies, state agencies, but it's typically tied to stormwater, but it's, you hear the term green infrastructure, different ways of doing site design to handle drainage, but it can get into other things, trying to lighten the development footprint on the landscape generally.
Got it.
Special areas in design, as you know, no surprise, we've been hearing about parking downtown throughout. So that is referenced in both documents, not in a big way, that's more to come on that topic, I'm sure. Of course, it wasn't called out in this section, it was elsewhere in the plan, but repeated that desire, of course, to make the linkage between downtown and the Platte River. And then another reference in this section to the mid-century architecture on Littleton Boulevard. One addition in this section is the page 76, 77, which is at the end of the day meant to be pages that face each other, so kind of like a spread in the document focused on the river corridor. So of all the sections, I believe this one probably was the lightest on changes.
We're on to the transportation master plan. Woohoo! You ready?
Ready.
I'm ready.
Go ahead.
I just wanna have one comment on the,
Yes.
I just wanna say thank you for all the inputs, the changes that were really good, it really addressed a lot of the comments and concerns. There, it really makes the document that much better.
I really like the way it reads. I like that you've added some of those graphics and visuals and bullets and things. It's not just paragraphs of copy. It's not repetitive. It doesn't have that redundancy that you might get in a document like this. I think it's fresh.
It's only one Kleenex box now instead of two. Old reference.
Robin, you mentioned it, but I have too. This is This is more Littletonized than the previous draft, which is a good thing, so it's very, very helpful, reads well.
Right, and I think, you know, to Gary's earlier point, obviously receiving the volume of comments that we did from the community and then also internally from staff, feedback that you provided, trying to blend all of those together, I think really did produce a much stronger, richer product to the end, so it really was that blend.
I have a question. On 83, at the top of the implementation, plan should be a living document that responds to change. That's a little awkward if we're trying to help cultivate and shape what happens. We want to be on top of change. I don't know that we need that response to change. If it's a living document, it's probably going to do that. But I don't want the city to be behind what happens, after the fact.
I think that's kind of stating that, saying, yeah, respond to change so they don't get behind.
Pardon?
I think that's statement means exactly what you're saying.
So I must not have said what I was trying to say. It's a living document, so it will change.
Right.
And different things, maybe we even anticipate possible change and want to put something in place so that we're not doing what we're doing now, in part, having to ignore stuff that we can't change, that we wish we could have.
I think the unwritten word there is unanticipated changes, which goes back to Mark's intro,
So that would be okay.
it's not gonna be perfect, so it's
No,
what it,
that's all right, I just, that's fine.
Sure. So thank you all again for having me. On the transportation master plan side, again, a lot of comments received over that time period. Generally, really constructive comments, varying from comments on policy points to specific projects in people's neighborhoods that they would like to see included. So really wide variety of comments, try to incorporate as much as we could. One major thing that's different here is the project list was updated in response to some of those comments and in response to some additional work by city staff as well in that time. So it's a new project list, a little bit higher dollar amount than what we had last time. So that's the bad news.
3 weeks.
But hopefully tonight we can kind of take that step back to where we all started a little bit and look at the mission and goals, because that's really the foundation for where this plan will go. The project list is likely to change again next year. There's a whole list of additional plans to be done that will affect that project list. But hopefully what doesn't change all that much is the overall mission and goals of the city moving forward. So as we walk through, kind of maybe have that bigger picture perspective about where we're headed here. So
Well, let's keep in mind, this is our very first transportation master plan, so I
Absolutely.
don't think that putting everything in the bucket is a bad idea. It will
Totally
get
agree.
cleaned out, it will get, there's a lot of things that are gonna change about this. It's probably gonna have more dynamic change than even the comp plan, but, we finally have a list.
Yep. Absolutely.
Keith, did you hear that?
Good answer.
Jennifer heard it.
And a lot of work yet to be done in the future, so.
Keith, when we get there, can you point out the language that talks about the list, that it really is just that, it's not that we're adopting that list and everything there is intended to be done or not? So if you could just point out some of that language of
Will do.
what it is and what it is not.
Yep.
Thank you.
One thing that's different between what Gary just went through and what we did is we did not highlight our changes, so apologies for that.
That makes for a slow read.
But I pretty much got them all right up here. On the introduction side, so the major comment here was more emphasis needed on the character of Littleton specifically. So there's some language sprinkled throughout this introduction, not wholesale changes to this introduction section, but just a little bit of additional feedback that we heard from the community and additional language along that line. Councilmember Elrod, some of that language that you just referred to is right here in the implementation bit on page 16. It's not just a list of action items, it's a challenging process that requires city's elected officials, that kind of language to set the table for all the work that needs to be done.
Somewhere in here, you guys did a replace all.
I think
We were just looking at that, city,
Yeah, exactly.
campus.
So you capitalize city and on page 13, at the bottom right, it changed capacity to a capital city. So you might want to go back and check some of them.
I think that was
And you
the
might want
last
to proofread
change.
your work.
I think that was the last change on October 3rd.
It's pretty glaring.
You were just testing us to see
There
if we
are
read it.
lots of
Jeez. Good catch, man.
Yeah, they're throughout, it's throughout.
Respect your.
Capacity is throughout the document.
Consistently throughout.
Thank you. Okay, anything else on the introduction? Okay, the existing city chapter. The major comment here was the need to emphasize the role of alternative modes as the city stands today, and how those modes either compete or don't compete with auto travel. Obviously, auto travel is the biggest mode in the city, and it is generally the most convenient. So there was some language, particularly as it relates to light rail and its competition with auto travel, that has been updated. And that's on page 24.
Carol, I would like to go back to page
Sure.
14. I made a request, I think 3 times. One of them was when I met with you, Robin, and I met with you individually, along with Kathleen, asking that this be reworded under choices. The healthiest and most vibrant communities understand that bicycling, walking, and transit, and so on. And could you explain your rationale for 3 requests and 3 promises to change that did not get changed?
I sure can. That comment was brought to this group, I think, as well. And I think in general, the group thought that that kind of language was appropriate. I'm happy to discuss that again as a larger group. Again, this
Can you
is
say
not.
what date we discussed that? Because I don't remember having that turned down.
I can't say. It might have been in the August meeting. I'm not sure. But I'm happy to discuss it again. Again, this is not my plan. This is this group's plan.
Well, my concern would be then with my multiple requests that you haven't said that, what you just said now, until now. Where we had that same conversation again and again and again, and each of them ended with, yeah, we can change it.
What do you want to
Yeah,
change?
what verbiage would you like?
The first time I brought it up with Keith was, where did you get the data that supports the statement, the healthiest and most vibrant communities understand that biking, walking, and transit are critical components? Where did that information come from?
What do you want to change to?
14.
It could be many. What I don't like is the assumption that communities, healthy and vibrant communities already understand this. And that has the implication that communities that don't understand this are sick and loggy,
Budgie.
pudgy. I think there's an insult in there, and that's mostly what I wanted to get out. I don't think it's necessary to say that.
There could be a way to soften the judgmental character of that.
Yeah,
if
that's
what you're
it,
feeling.
that's it.
So the healthiest and most vibrant communities incorporate bicycling, walking, and transit as critical components of the transportation system.
Or consider.
Incorporate.
I
think
agree with
there's.
that. I agree with that.
Okay,
That's a good
You
recommendation.
can shorten it just by saying many communities.
Many
It's-
communities.
It doesn't have to be that long.
Why say all of that? It
Exactly.
doesn't tell us
Yeah.
anything at all.
I do think there's, so I think vibrant is something that you do see, and there's many examples of cities that show and have adapted these various modes and have made them more vibrant as a result.
And what does vibrant
So-
mean?
Well, it's just active and economically viable and all of that. So I like Jason's recommendation.
Me too. Yeah, okay.
Okay, everybody okay with that change?
Yes.
Okay. Do you mind making that edit in this draft for final? Please, thank you.
Will do. I wanna get it right, so.
Jason, you wanna say it again?
The healthiest and most vibrant communities incorporate bicycling, walking, and transit as critical components of the transportation system.
Got it?
Right.
Okay.
Cool.
Got page 16?
It's all the other.
Oh, wait, no, we're on page 18.
Except for
Which
us.
doesn't.
It's a little soft around the edges.
Page 18?
Yes.
Yep, so page 18, just again, on the existing city side, there were a few comments to incorporate, we had already incorporated previous comments. So the main one was about the challenge faced with transit travel in the city compared to auto travel, so there was some language that changed on page 24. And then there was some other wordsmithing throughout the
On to mission and goals, which begins on page 31.
Okay. Okay, so we actually had quite a few changes within this chapter. The mission statement did not change from what you had seen last time. Goals, there were just a couple of tweaks to some language, just really minor wordsmithing. The main change here is the objectives list, which is on page 39. You guys we had feedback that we should consolidate the bicycle and pedestrian objectives. So we did that, consolidated those into, you'll see these on page 40 actually, active transportation objectives. And then we actually added a couple of auto-oriented objectives to better delineate with what the objectives are for auto travel.
Which two did you add?
I think it was provide an efficient automotive network and provide a roadway network that allows for excellent emergency response, I believe, were the two. And then there were also some other wordsmithing changes to this objectives.
You say combine pedestrian and bicycling, you just put that under active itself, because they are very unique too, because you're gonna have pedestrians on sidewalks and bicycles not on sidewalks, generally speaking.
Right. And so I think the feedback was that there was maybe too much delineation between what specific objectives we were trying for with say, bicycle network. So there were a couple that were combined with pedestrian.
I think also the desire to match those modes and how we were talking about them within the context of the plan. So, that's, the active chapter includes both of those as part of that. So I think it was trying to get a little bit, both the consolidation pieces, but then also kind of create some of that same language that you would see in terms of the implementation and specific to projects.
Just a clarification on the ones that were added. This is for Keith Reister. Provide an efficient automotive network. Is that intended to say, is that like operational efficient? How we use in a lot of the terminology when we talk about this?
Yeah, it's, the focus was, we're gonna, in order to, a lot of the commentary we had, what's noted in the notes from the transportation board is, we can't necessarily build our way out of congestion, so technology is gonna be an important component of our transportation system going forward and our ability to maximize opportunities for.
Do you think we need the word operational efficient? Okay. And then on the provide a roadway network that allows for excellent emergency response. So why are we choosing the word excellent? And I'm a little concerned that excellent forces or gives the opportunity for emergency response vehicles to say, I need an extra wide road to get through, and then that starts creating really big roads.
They already do.
Yeah.
Well,
In my experience in this business, they already do. And that's why they have opticons and traffic lights. So, the discussion around that is, our police services, we want to make sure that they can get where they need to. An example of how that's happened in the past in this community is the depression of the railroad. The primary reason for the depression of the railroad was emergency services. Because the town would be bifurcated by emergency services and they couldn't respond. So that's an example of how you work on things like that. The fire guys, they always ask for big roads.
Right, so, why the choice, or where did that comment come that it had to be excellent, and how do you actually measure if it's excellent or not?
Right, and measures are something that need to be developed as part of the next steps from this plan. How you would measure excellent would, as far as emergency responses, generally response time.
We do have to speak to that specifically, South Metro Fire is ISO certified, one of the few in the nation, and so they strive, the term excellence would come related to their service provisions as a partner for us specifically, I would say too. And I know our police chief would agree with excellent.
For that reason, we're moving.
Is it what?
Nothing.
That means no more speed bumps on our street, please.
They don't like the
Speed hump.
Suggestion, which everybody probably will poo-poo, but anyway. I went through and I tallied how many of the related goals each of these did. And I have two possible suggestions. They can't do both. One would be to list these in the order of frequency, the number of goals that are met, which would mean the topic would vary down the list. The other would be to just take the topics and then put the frequency in the several items in the topics in order, so people could see how these are the ones, this meant like five of them, or 4 of them, or whatever, and this meant only one of the goals, because in terms of prioritizing any money to address these, that might help in the decision process. Hope that makes sense.
What I like about the way it's presented now though, Peggy, it's by grouping of topics. It'd be hard to read this if we have one quality of life here and another one over there. I do like that they're grouped by the topic so that you can kind of.
But the other
And
way.
then the objective is in order too, so it's the same,
And the other way, number one, if you have it online, you can just maybe sort it yourself, copy it and create your own, would be to have it both ways. Because otherwise, you can do what I did, and doesn't matter, I'm not gonna be on council, so it just was helpful to me to see some of these that addressed 5 things, and some of these addressed, I think they were all addressed at least 2, so.
Okay, the way it is.
I think it's fine the way it is, and I think when there's 5 dots, people will see that it addressed all 5 things.
Yeah, and anytime you get into charting like this, there's different ways that people wanna categorize it for themselves. I think this is probably the most generic. And
some of that further discussion happens by mode.
yeah,
And then for the project list, really how those rankings, if you remember, they sort of go through a ranking and scoring system. That's really a discussion about how well they align with these objectives here. And so you'll start to see where a lot of them begin to become very clear their alignment with those objectives and how they relate back. So I think you'll see both as we get into those other chapters.
So one of the things that was brought up last time, and it's on page 39, was what exactly does balanced mode share mean? And at that time, there was no definition, it was unknown. So I was kind of looking here to see if it was defined, what does that mean, what does balanced mode share mean? Maybe it's there and I missed it, but is there more definition to this now, or is it still the nebulous, we're gonna have to decide later?
It's still the nebulous, we're gonna have to decide later, unfortunately. I don't think that this body or generally the community even is at a place where it has defined that.
So it's like a placeholder at this point, like, it's kind of a placeholder, it sounds like, because last time you just scored everything the same, I think you said you gave it 3 out of 5, so it's just a placeholder. Okay, thank you.
next.
Okay, the next major comment was on the street types. There's some added clarity to what some of the
page?
Starting on page 42.
There's some added clarity to what some of these street types have for pedestrian and bicycle or could have for pedestrian and bicycle facilities, landscaping, on-street parking, those kinds of treatments. Some of the pictures changed. There was a comment to add some examples, so that information is all now in this table.
Yeah, I think this is better. Thank you for that.
Similarly, for the overlays, there were some comments on the overlay pedestrian and bicycle priority streets that are articulating that it's trade-offs instead of sacrifices. So those kinds of changes.
The word sacrifice is still in there twice.
Yeah, it's actually throughout it, you start with the trade-off, but then it says require sacrificing under all of them, and I believe, and I went back and looked at my notes, that the word evaluate was what we were gonna do instead of using the word sacrifice in that manner. So, because it's still throughout there, even though maybe it doesn't say sacrifice in the beginning, it says sacrifice throughout all the overlays.
What page are you on all the overlays?
44, 45, those two. So we talked about, and that was a point because of the comment someone had made about not using sacrifice and.
Yeah, all
Okay.
of the trade-off sections, where
Yeah,
you
it's-
have the heading trade-off, all of those still say sacrifice.
It's like this priority will require sacrificing, so,
Perhaps it could say trading.
yeah, or evaluating is, evaluating was the word that occurred, but trading, evaluating. But that was the word that was discussed in here that seemed to have the acceptance, was evaluating.
I didn't like the word sacrificing either, so if you could take
What
that
was the
out,
word you wanted to use? Is that?
whatever's
What
left.
came up at the last meeting was, and I believe our lawyer came up with it, was evaluate. Yeah, sorry, I shouldn't don't point the finger over there, but evaluate was the word that seemed to had the most comfort level for people, was to use the word evaluate.
So that it's gonna reduce the number of modes or whatever, so.
Yeah, but that was just the conversation we had, and that was the agreement that had come out, so.
Is everybody okay with that?
I'm not clear where that is, what is that?
Page 44.
It used to be
Trade-off.
Yeah.
It's talking about
Look under bicycle in the
something's
paragraph.
gotta give.
Trade-off,
So much
sacrifice.
Priority will
Trade-off,
require-
I really don't care.
sacrifice, trade-off,
Let's just go to the next
sacrifice,
section.
evaluate, I guess.
But where it says this priority will require sacrificing space for some other mode.
Instead.
Well, it's not gonna require evaluating, it is gonna require sacrificing.
Well, it's not necessarily going to require sacrificing, you know, we don't wanna use the word sacrifice, I don't anyway, because it implies that somebody has to give up something for somebody else to get something.
But
And that's not necessarily so.
Isn't that what a trade-off
Space,
is?
yeah, that's what trade-off is.
No, it doesn't have to be a sacrifice, it can be a negotiation, it can be a give and take, but it's not necessarily take it from one and give it to the other.
One issue that we're working with Littleton is that our right-of-ways are constrained. I think it was pointed out in the introduction that we can't just add more lanes or more right-of-way to our streets. So we only have so much space to work with. So it is sort of establishing priorities and deciding which mode is going to have to give up a little bit in order to promote a different mode. Whether that's auto in, adding a turn lane, whether it's pedestrians by widening sidewalks or bicycles by adding bike lanes.
Things that
It's a
Mark
trade-off.
suggested for in Broadway, on Broadway.
Don't remember.
Well, on Broadway, the lanes are very wide. And so Mark has suggested a couple times that there is room on Broadway to put additional things on Broadway without having fewer lanes. And if you go out and walk along Broadway, you can see the lanes are huge. And so you could add something without sacrificing a lane.
So a recommendation to that might be compromise, because compromise is still a little bit more of like a negotiation. There, you may compromise something, but it's not a full outright, say, sacrifice. So I think compromise still recognizes that we may have to compromise a lane, but it also says it's part of an evaluation. So I think compromise might be a
I'm okay with sacrifice.
Prioritize, I liked when you said prioritize,
Mm-hmm.
because you have to prioritize space for some other mode, that's what you're doing.
Prioritization of space.
I think that's
I'm good with either.
Prioritization of space is
All
good.
right, yeah, let's go with that. Let's
Boom,
go.
prioritization, take out sacrifice, excellent.
And Keith, it occurs 4 different times, so you need to change all of those.
He knows how to word search.
Yeah, we know he knows how to do that. Find a replace all.
City.
Take it over mantle.
City.
I didn't even see that.
Okay.
All right, next.
Chapter 4 that begins on page 48.
So auto and freight chapter, major feedback we heard, we went through a lot of shifts in the policy language last time we all met. There was obviously concern about how we handle Santa Fe, the Santa Fe corridor and the river corridor in general. And then in general, the public feedback confirmed the direction of the auto and freight chapters, that, there's a lot of auto and freight projects there that are focused on safety and operations in general, with the acknowledgement that there are likely to be some capacity needs in the future as well. So, again, we rephrased some of the policy points to reflect that feedback. And then one big change here is the access preservation area, which I want to flip ahead to.
Page.
Page 63.
60.
Which is the map of the auto projects, has figure 10 on it. So the way we've kind of identified this access preservation area along the river corridor is through this hatched area between South Platte Park and the Santa Fe corridor. there was a little bit of consternation about showing a specific alignment for a South Platte Parkway extension. So in order to set us up for the PEL process, the CDOT study that's coming up, the city is leaning towards an identification here of a access preservation area, which goes into that PEL process saying, CDOT, we need to maintain access, provide better access, perhaps provide an alternate route through this area. So that is also defined a couple places throughout the document. It's in the glossary. I think it's on it's on page 60. Number 5, ensure properties have access to Santa Fe Drive or Market Road. So generally that's the change there instead of showing the South Platte extension.
So Keith, there's a natural opportunity down there for what you could call a frontage road of sorts. There is a natural opportunity. There are properties that are in the way, but there is some road. What concerns me and what I'm hearing a lot of concern from citizens is the colored in pink. That cuts through neighborhoods, open space, and property that's been developed, like Breckenridge Brewery and Designs Within. That is protected space. That is open space. We are not gonna run a road through there. So I don't know why it's colored pink and says new streets.
Access
No, this
preservation
corner
area.
area is south of
So, and we
Overreacting.
we heard from, we heard that feedback.
So
And what it was like a fuzzy pink caterpillar.
Yeah.
And people said, what is this? And we said, well, that's our way to communicate as effectively as we can at this point with CDOT, that access to both residents and businesses is vitally important. And so we're like, oh, that caterpillar got it all wrong. Like,
Yeah,
that
he did.
didn't
He had to move. He
communicate
moved.
what we
He's
were
like,
trying to do
"Oh,
at
it's in a
all.
better place." But here's the question, so part of that is that area where you're talking about the quads. Can we be more specific in that area? Because the other is very undefined, because that's still very transitional, and there could be, we're not talking about the quads that with the PEL. Is there a way to be, or do you feel that you've covered that well enough to not send fire alarms through neighborhoods?
Quad roads. So in general, the quad roads are still up in the air.
Keith, let me step in here. I think there's still some decisions that need to be made about what is the interim solution to Mineral and Santa Fe, whether it's a quad road or a continuous flow intersection. We just have not formally decided that. There's trade-offs. If it was an easy decision, believe me, we would have been before council here.
Okay, so
Sacrifice.
I know.
Well, I said quad because that's kind of where we left it last, so it's just whatever that option, but I think
I think this, and I'm sorry, Mayor, but I think this is worthy of some discussion here because we did get a lot of public comment about this. And I want to make sure that it is not misunderstood. In fact, I think the reason why we have classified this as a access preservation area is because we are concerned about the conversation with CDOT and how we maintain access for all of our businesses and property owners along that corridor. So we never intended, I heard some comments that, somehow this is a road that cuts through the open space adjacent to the river. That was never the intent.
the pink caterpillar was.
Yes, so, could we have frontage roads and segments along there? Possibly. But I think this is a signal back to CDOT that we take this area very seriously and that preservation of access is a big issue for us. So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Keith, but that's the intent, what we're trying to communicate. Is that fair?
Yes. And I was gonna say, with the CDOT process, it's moving away from the typical conversation of controlling and managing access to really say, we need something different than just those two things.
So if that's the intent, is there language that and we're maybe missing it? So is there language that we need to put in here of what that intent is so that it's clear and it's, we don't have to keep calling you, Keith, say, what was your intent?
So let's read the language in the glossary, because that is the. What page is that?
Where do we have?
Page 7.
7?
Yeah, I didn't see that.
Yeah, it's access preservation.
To go to the end.
The beginning. In the beginning. And I'll read it aloud while everybody else flips.
Access preservation area, I see.
Access preservation area. The planning and environmental linkages study led by CDOT begins in 2019 and will consider future alternatives for the US 85 Santa Fe Drive thoroughfare. There are numerous uses in the corridor, including residential, commercial, and retail, needing a variety of access routes to Santa Fe Drive. The access preservation area will raise awareness with CDOT and stakeholders that the needs of all corridor residents, property owners, and businesses must be considered when reviewing potential future alternatives.
Wow.
Amos.
Sounds good.
Yeah, good, good name in there.
I wonder if there is any value in adding open space. Because there's
That's why I paused there, because your comment there, I thought maybe we should add open space to that.
Because there's an abundance of that down there. Some are just smaller pockets, but it will need to be worked around for certain.
And it's also providing access to the river in places too,
Correct.
so you just open space covers that.
Okay, do it.
Add open space, okay.
Yep.
If you guys can put that into the final, thank you. Okay, now we're back to what page?
We're on page 69 of active transportation, chapter 5.
I did want to mention one other thing on, sorry. Back on page 63, there is a project, number 3, which if you look on the table, page 60, Santa Fe and Mineral Alternative Intersection Configuration, Quadrant Roadway or Continuous Flow Intersection. And again, that's marked as an interim project. So again, not knowing exactly what that solution may turn out to be, it is one of the projects on the list.
Okay, cool.
Active transportation, chapter 5, page 69. Okay, so a lot of the feedback here was based on the maps. There was some difficulty understanding some of the maps, and this is some of the technical analysis that leads to the identification of gaps in the active transportation system and what those closing those gaps might lead to. So quite a few updates to the maps in this section, a few updates to the project list, but nothing major that changed a lot of the, project totals or anything like that. So that's the main change here, in addition to some of the policy discussion, like on the
This isn't on the maps, this is back on page 71.
Okay.
And it's under the pedestrian level of traffic stress.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes on into page 72, it's the Oregon method.
Mm-hmm.
This had come up in the planning commission, Jason had brought it up and Mark had made similar comments and which were similar to what I'm about to say now about, this doesn't seem Littletonized. It's, we looked at different neighborhoods, I looked into my community and I pulled up the map and looked at color. And my community, which is it's a suburb, it's just local streets, but it has 3s and 4s, which is moderate stress and is suitable for adults, includes higher speedway roadways, and then 4, high traffic stress, only able-bodied adults with limited route choices would use this facility. I'm in Oak Brook. I watch kids go up and down our sidewalk all the time. These 3s and 4s don't match, but yet my community shows 3s and 4s. It seems like there's a disconnect on reality versus what we're seeing here, because those aren't 3s and 4s. sure, there's improvements available, but I don't think that you can say only able-bodied adults with limited route choices are gonna walk down streets in Oak Brook. So my concern is it's there's a huge disconnect.
Okay. So just a little bit about the method here and why we went this route. A lot of research has shown that children are uncomfortable walking on narrow sidewalks. When you have a sidewalk less than 5 feet, basically, you're too close to the cars. You're unable to pass, even children are unable to pass each other going opposite directions. So that is the basis of this. I totally understand that there are local roads that carry hardly any cars at all. And therefore, kids are comfortable walking on the street. The difference here is whether or not we want to be okay with kids walking on the street, which is a choice for the city, for sure. Or if we want to provide everybody a pedestrian facility that's adequate for 2 people to walk side by side and pass another person going the other direction. So
That's a good thing what you're saying, but this is saying it's high traffic stress and that it's high speed cars, only adults. So I'm not disagreeing with the philosophy, because it's a decent philosophy. But this is saying that it's high, where's the high speed?
I don't think it's saying all of them exist there, I'm just saying those are examples of reasons why.
This says traffic speeds are moderate to high. That's what it says. It doesn't say, it just says this are moderate to high. It just is a disconnect, that's all. It doesn't quite function the way.
yeah, that's fair. And when you're a pedestrian at traffic speed that's
I
over
know, that's
25, basically is a moderate speed. So under 25, probably not high speed, but when it's 25 and over, it gets to be that high speed for a pedestrian. It's where pedestrians start to get injured or killed. Your likelihood of surviving a wreck really dramatically reduces as speeds go up. So, and it's at that level of 25.
This is saying able-bodied adults are avoiding this area. Again, they're not.
Well, I had the same concern with in and around Kaylee. I don't think you don't have the time to go back and analyze every street. A lot of them with 3-foot sidewalks,
Right.
but they've got slower traffic or they've got curbs or whatever, they'll slow things down. But the point is that the map's a little bit untrue in reality. It's not Littletonized.
I agree with that. I mean, I look at Mineral Avenue and that is indicated as being easier, safer, and probably because it does have a larger sidewalk, but I definitely feel more comfortable riding my bike in my neighborhood than I do on Mineral Avenue.
Let's talk about pedestrian and bikes. I mean, if you're walking on the sidewalk on Mineral, you got a detached sidewalk here 10 feet away, I feel more comfortable walking on Mineral.
Is it specific to pedestrian?
This is pedestrian space.
Yeah.
Well, I think the points are well made, that there's, yeah, it's not perfect in certain streets. You can go one block and have a different experience on another street, so we're not gonna get it perfect. But this is definitely something we should probably,
I think what this
transportation board could work on this.
accomplishes, rather than saying this individual block or set of blocks, it's look at the map in a whole. Littleton itself is not very pedestrian friendly. We've got narrow sidewalks. You can't pass. I can't walk on the sidewalk holding my kid's hands because it's too narrow. And so when we're all in a row, having a kid run up 15, 20 feet in front of us, up to a corner, yeah, that's stressful, even in Oak Brook. I think, you don't know when there's a car coming around. So I think that's the general big picture is the streets of Littleton aren't pedestrian friendly.
Yet in Oak Brook, the sidewalks are plenty wide where you could hold a kid by the hand. They're plenty wide to do that. 2 adults can walk side by side on the sidewalks. There's no doubt about it. I live there too.
So this would, I think, be a good project to have the Transportation Mobility Board could spend a little bit more time diving into some of this and maybe being able to.
This will be, I'll add to this. once we actually get an asset management program up and running, we'll be able to classify every section of sidewalk in the city. And to add to this, it's block by block in this city. We have stuff that's 18 inches wide, that's considered a sidewalk, that's not safe under any condition and any speed. And we also have over 4,000 locations in the city that are not even close to being ADA compliant. So once we get beyond the able-bodied people, under law, we're required to address other levels of mobility. So we can map this in detail once we get to that point, and we can go through that. At the end of the day, I guess the way we've talked about this with the Transportation Board is that the safety of a pedestrian will always feel different than the safety of someone in a car. And the reason we pick 25 miles an hour here is because once you get above that, that's when people start dying. That's a very proven statistic for pedestrians. So that's why we hang our hat on 25. And this also goes to, a council member sent me a concern today about speeding in a neighborhood that is all by itself. There's no way to cut through. So the only people speeding in there are their neighbors. And this is very common.
It is.
And so, at the end of the day, you're whipping into a neighborhood, there's a kid playing in the street or walking in the street, you've got a problem. So at the end of the day, can we fix every sidewalk to be super wide? No. Is it even possible? No. But we're gonna map that out over time, and we just consider everybody when we're trying to work it for it.
I think the map makes the point.
So.
Okay. Sounds good. Next.
Okay.
Chapter 6, transit, that begins on page 101. 101.
So on the transit side, there were not a lot of significant comments. There was some clarity added to what our role is on transit. I want to add one thing on the TOD discussion. It's just kind of a close story about that. But when we were at a stakeholder meeting on the river corridor, a couple of RTD members or staff members were there. One of whom is the transit-oriented development guide, and the other is a service planner. And the transit-oriented development guy says, I'm the transit-oriented development guy, and this is the development-oriented transit guy. And the point is, you can only provide good transit service where people can get to it easily, and where there are enough people that want to use it. And so that's, if you want transit-oriented development, it should be oriented to that, where it actually makes sense to increase transit service. So, Broadway corridor, if you went out and put BRT on Broadway today, it would do okay, but it would do a whole heck of a lot better if there was actually development on that corridor centered around real transit stations, and there was a plan for that. So, something to consider as you go into your zoning discussions and discussions with RTD and that corridor study that's coming up. How's that gonna play out there? And then obviously at your 2 light rail stations too, so.
And you've achieved it when those developments are advertising their proximity to the transit. That's why they're there.
Yeah.
Well, and there's a real aversion in this community towards actually building TOD because it requires density and it requires possibly height. And there's a real aversion to that. So whether it's appropriate next to the light rail, which it is, because that's why they put it in, and that's why all the stations that are being built, there are high density apartments, obviously, since that's all they build these days, going in, because that is what it is. But there is a real disconnect in Littleton with that, and I think part of that comes from the fact that we were early on in the light rail, and that wasn't something that was heavily preached then. It was just really exciting to get the light rail in. I think we could get down to Denver really fast, and so then I think that we had that was in some ways a disadvantage for us because we were completely not ready for that. Inglewood suffers from that a bit too. They've created, kind of redesigned over there because they had a better opportunity because of the large shopping mall that goes out. But I think those are challenges when we're talking about the transit, is kind of the community, as you talk about that community culture. There's a real aversion to that, and how do we create kind of a community acceptance of, this is a good place for the density, these are bad places for the density, and try to be able to support our stations better, because we do have opportunities at both of them, just right now not being utilized. Peggy, did you have a question?
Well, comment. At least some people walk to the light rail. We live, I think, about a mile from the downtown light rail. Sometimes my husband will drive the car so that when we come home at night, we don't walk home in the dark, but I like getting the exercise walking there, and I enjoy going through the neighborhood, sort of transitional neighborhood, whatever. And, so I walk, unless it's icy, raining, or lightning. I mean, it can lighten without the rain. I won't walk in that stuff. Then sometimes on the way home I've gotten surprised and it's doing all kinds of stuff. So the walkability part, in my view, and even a mile away, and I think some people walk even probably from the other side of Ridge Road to the downtown light rail, some people. And so, we have to think, some people get their daily aerobics by walking darn fast, carrying their soup, their briefcase and all. So recognizing that, but also if it's icy, lightning, whatever, they're gonna wanna get there a different way.
Drive.
Park in the muddy lot.
And providing those options.
Yeah.
In those days.
Yeah.
First and final mile.
Yeah.
Things are all priorities that, RTD is thinking about, other cities, Littleton here, definitely. So it's a big next step.
Next.
Okay.
Chapter 7, Mobility Trends, page 117.
Okay, again, not a lot of significant concern from this body or from the public. We went over some policy point refinement the last time we all met, but not a lot of major grades to this chapter.
So you whizzed along, I had another comment before you got there.
Okay.
And I can't find the page, but it relates to the area between the little islands and the sidewalk and so forth. And if you're walking and you're trying to cross the street, it's difficult for plows to actually get up in there to clear that snow out. So I don't know if that's a design thing that you want to rethink a little bit, or conceptually, are people going to walk on stuff that hasn't been cleared yet?
You're referring to the islands,
The
like
little islands that are sometimes next to a curb with a little gutter, a wide gutter between, what do you call them, Mark?
median,
Yeah, curb extensions, is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, there's little
These-
cut pictures.
Because they let the water drain
Right.
past, right?
Right.
So keeping that area clear enough for people to cross. Because if you're.
Keith will take care of it.
Yeah.
Get on it, Get on it, Keith.
Peggy, if you get to some of those spots, call me, I'll give you a shovel.
I was going to say, I know you're gonna give me my own shovel.
Might make a few bucks while you're out there too.
Take a cane.
And a dog. Okay, next.
Okay.
Chapter 8, Complete Network, page 123.
Okay, so one of the major items here was the critical corridor summaries, which were very much just a skeleton the last time We presented them as the project lists evolved, and we identified projects along those critical corridors. Those have now been added to the critical corridor maps. The other thing is just some minor updates to the street type maps and overlay maps, just as a result of some of the feedback from the public and city staff during that time, so.
Keith? I don't know if it's here or if it's all the way back in page 88. So the complete streets where there's pedestrian, there's bike, there's auto, and so I think back in 88, unless you would say it belongs here, Littleton Boulevard is not identified as a complete street, and that doesn't seem right to me.
As a complete street, meaning that it has an overlay for each of the different priorities?
That it would have, pedestrian, bike, auto, what's that?
Littleton's not.
I know it doesn't have it, but shouldn't it? I mean, thinking about it from the future, to make that.
That wasn't what we discussed. We discussed having Powers maybe be the bike and pedestrian route.
So because Powers is identified as a bicycle street and it's 1 block away, that is why Littleton, which is its right of way is constrained, has not been identified as a bicycle street. Again, there are trade-offs. So not every street can provide services. So that is the reason, is because there's that really good parallel corridor.
And that does work pretty good. And Powers has a bike lane on the north side of it, so it works out pretty good.
Littleton
I hardly
Boulevard
ever
is what
get
takes you to the light rail station, and Littleton Boulevard is what accesses neighborhood from both sides. I don't recall that decision being made, but I'm really surprised that it would not be a complete street. I actually think, with all the businesses that are there, it just makes it obviously a lot more vibrant, especially as we think about, and we've talked about, Main Street really being, Littleton Boulevard being the extension of Main Street, and so.
And there are bike racks here and there for people, so they gotta get there somehow. I'm supporting it. I mean, if you're inviting people to come on a bike, there ought to be good streets to get there.
Yeah, I just.
It's not working. Mark, would you explain your explanation of this?
Well, let's see. Yeah, I think this is just my view. I've talked to a couple council members about this. I think I'm looking at the bike priority map, figure 25 on page 126. It does show Powers as kind of the east-west corridor. That has been an established route even before my time as a bike route. And I think I've even seen maps and construction drawings around Littleton Boulevard, kind of the intent clearly was to move bikes to Powers. Now, I think one of the questions that every city kind of wrestles with is, in some of these higher classification streets, collectors and above, do you really even want bikes on that corridor? And I think once you start getting into the higher volumes and velocity, then you tend to want to detach them from the street. And I think, in fact, we had a conversation about County Line as maybe one of those, where perhaps we're getting to the point where we need to detach the bicycles from the street. So, again, there's all sorts of strategies, but I think what I'm seeing here is, for the figure 25, is probably reinforcing what the city has decided here for the last several years, at least on that particular Littleton Boulevard issue.
I don't know that I don't know when that decision was made and what the basis of that decision was, but looking at, what we are, looking back at the character map, we are talking about Main Street, Littleton Boulevard kind of being the core or the spine through our city, and that's where we want all the activity to happen, the shops, the people interacting, and does that mean we have to have some trade-offs? Potentially, but it just feels like Powers is like it's out of the way, like I'm not gonna, it feels awkward.
You don't want people riding Littleton. I ride enough. You don't want people riding Littleton.
Well, but if it's designed in such a way that it
Down
feels
the road,
safer,
right, I agree,
but
down
that's
the
my
road.
point, if we don't, if
But we
we
can
don't
change that down the
put
road.
that as a complete street, then we will not
So-
consider it or, explore. Well, I don't know what the word was.
Keith, it's Littleton Boulevard is elsewhere in the plan, in several places, is identified as one of the critical corridors where a corridor study needs to be completed. And those are the kind of things that would come out through that public engagement process, the corridor study, property owners, users, all those things. So, that'll be part of the discussion about what the future of that
Perfect.
corridor is when we tackle it, when we get to it.
So again, I'm concerned that we're excluding it because again, in some areas, we're saying it's just planting the seed. So here again, I'd like to plant the seed,
That's a good argument.
right? To potentially consider Littleton Boulevard as a complete street.
Okay, that's a good point.
And our emphasis with this plan has been more on the complete networks because of the types of feedback we've heard from the community. That not every mode fits on every street, there is constrained right of way. So we've definitely emphasized that network piece as opposed to having a conversation about complete streets. I don't think that anywhere in this document we kind of flesh out that idea of a complete street as much as we do a complete network.
And
So that
complete
means
streets
that
is
there might-
almost a whole nother generation of thinking about this. And I think the purposes of this, I would be okay with the way it is, but I do hear what Karina is saying, and it has been one of the corridors that the council has talked about repeatedly about dropping a plan on top of it and doing something. We talked about the streetscaping that we were gonna do years ago, and that was gonna extend down Littleton Boulevard, which would provide better sidewalks, better bicycling, better lights, better cross traffic and things like that. So that's something that council needs to put on their to-do list to do, drop a master plan on that. And what's great about this though, having the transportation plan and the comp plan, is it doing that master plan on there, you've got so much, you're starting with so much more than you were prior to that. So, are we okay with leaving this like this and
Where can we drop that seed then? Where else is it if it's not here?
Transportation guys, the board, I think the transportation board, that's what we task to give.
In Keith's plan, like he's talking about this corridors.
do you wanna drop the seed to do a corridor study on Littleton Boulevard? Well, right here.
It's in there.
Dropped.
We're going
Smart
to.
plan.
We are, surely we're going.
It's in the plan.
We should have one as well.
8 AM.
Page.
Okay.
Alright. Next. Bruce?
Real quick question on figure 24 on page 125. The east-west street that you've got highlighted north of Mineral that connects Alatty, Windermere, and Prince, is that Front Range Road?
That's,
Talking about Ridge?
It's not Ridge, it's.
Yeah, right.
Well, whatever road it is, it might
Fremont,
be.
isn't it?
should label it.
Then go.
Yeah, it wouldn't hurt. Is it Fremont?
I think that's Rangeview.
Rangeview. Rangeview.
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Oh, I see what you're looking at.
And I guess, sort of the same conversation here, if you wanna, maybe labeling some of those would be helpful. I think the one over on the left is the one that runs through Aspen Grove, which, certainly that's pedestrian priority kind of stuff. Refresh my memory on this because I'm not overtly seeing Ridge Road as being pedestrian priority. I can see bike. But, there aren't a lot of sidewalks over there.
But there is room to walk. There's a lot of gravel. There's like 6 feet of gravel on each side.
Okay, well, what was the thinking?
So the thinking with Ridge Road is it's one of the main east-west connector streets for all those neighborhoods. And there is a bus line, 66 runs along 66, which a bus line without pedestrian facilities is difficult to navigate. So that is the thinking along.
Okay. All right, well, I guess you've got some other streets in here, for example, that, and this is sort of a nit, but I mean, you've got some streets here that are identified without being priority, so Peakview is an east-west street, but it's not a priority street.
Priority. It's not
Pedestrian priority as you're defining, just mainly because there's no bus line.
That, and, you know, these are intended to be your major connector streets that, you know,
Well, I'll put it this way, you've got
Connect
it labeled, but
schools
it's not a major street.
transits.
So you would rather have
Only the.
the red one down here labeled and not have Peakview?
Well, that's just-
That makes sense to
Isn't
me
it?
too,
Yeah, I don't know why we'd have Lake or Peakview
Same to do
labeled
it.
and not have Rangeview if that's pedestrian.
That is a nit, you're absolutely right.
That's a good another good catch, Bruce, good catch.
Sorry.
Okay, that can be something that Transportation Mobility Board can work on.
Exactly.
Karina?
I'm sorry, I'm gonna go back to, you said, okay, planting the seed is with Mark, but I don't think planting the seed is just with Mark. I'd like to see that Littleton corridor study somewhere in here, and I didn't see it in the
I
comprehensive
think they
plan.
said it is. Could you find it, please?
Yep.
Is Broadway in there as well?
132.
What is it?
132.
In the comp plan, right?
Yes. No, the transportation plan, the transportation plan.
You got it. It is one of the critical corridors.
Seed planted.
Thank you.
On page 132.
May it grow.
Next.
You just got ahead of us, Karina, that's all.
Okay, so on the implementation
Chapter 9, which begins on
section,
135.
thank you. There was a scoring, the weights, scoring weight criteria that was incorrect, so that was corrected. Project lists were refined, I mentioned that earlier. A few projects were added, a few were removed. One of the main changes here was a change from the term prioritization to goal and objective alignment. The point there being that this is basically an unconstrained list of projects that is kind of a wish list, and when we had it quote unquote prioritized, that seemed to signal to some people that we were gonna do number one before we did anything else.
It sure did.
And so changing that language to goal and alignment scoring allows a little bit of flexibility as the city moves forward with its capital improvements plans and programs and that kind of thing. So it's just a scoring that shows you how it aligns with the transportation plan's goals.
Cool.
Okay.
Next.
The back cover.
And then here's just a sneak preview of how the scoring changed slightly because of the adjustments that we're making to scoring. So, but all of that's in the plan as well, so.
What page is that?
179's back cover.
Back cover?
179, the very back.
The last page,
167 is the project score.
that ain't ours.
So that,
167.
Right.
Well, you changed the format or the ranking system. You had a couple of pedestrian bridge overpasses that were now gone, or they're further down the list. So what happened to your weighing system that changed the list?
It wasn't the weighting, there was some feedback about some of the scoring, and this was staff feedback. So some of the scoring changed for the pedestrian bike locations, basically, to better address how those addressed certain safety problems, basically. And so that's how some of that scoring shifted.
What were you saying about what language did you change that you called it changed it from prioritization to ranking, is that what you said?
So no, it's an alignment with the goals and objectives.
Page
Because that was the
166.
intent of the ranking, was to look at the series of objectives that sort of trickle down from the goals.
Yep.
And then basically create that ranking based on how well they align. And so, you know, to Keith's earlier point, wasn't intended as a list that you do one, check that off and move on to project number 2. But a tool for the Transportation Mobility Board and staff to continue to reflect on what is aligned best with those goals and objectives and what may be opportunities for partnership and funding.
Partnership and funding, big piece of that. Allow yourselves some flexibility to select those projects to move forward as funding becomes available.
It brings back the Peter Kageyama idea of being strategically principled, tactically flexible. So,
Any other questions? Okay, so we have a couple of tweaks that you guys are gonna make in there. Other than that, you can pretty much see this show up planning, you get it on Monday and hand it off to us on Tuesday. No, it'll be a public hearing, so we will vote on it Tuesday night.
I had some minor edits that I already sent to Mark and Kathleen that were more copy edits. They weren't changing the meaning, so I already sent those along. So I'm not gonna bring those forward as amendments. I'll let staff kind of clean up some of that language.
Okay. As long as there's nothing substantive or, okay, I'll let Mark be
Yeah,
the judge
we'll
of
look at
that.
that. Yeah, I didn't see anything offhand that was concerned.
Okay.
Let's see. I was gonna say something and now I lost my train of thought. Want a good night, maybe?
You guys on for 15?
There's no doubt that this was an incredible heavy lift, and I think, you know, one of the things that I reflect back on is, and I'm glad you guys included so much of it in the plan, is all of the prior work that had been done. So there had been a lot of work prior, over the last 5 to 10, even 12 years, where there was, you could see efforts trying to work on corridors or work on areas or work on issues. Some of those are rather outdated. Many of them still have some decent substance, and the fact that they were brought in on this and continue to be referred back to, because those were also public documents that the public contributed to. It really is, we're able to complete this, hopefully, like next week will be completed in under 2 years, but it's 10 to 12 years of work that has actually built up into this, and you can see that here. And the conversations here with the Planning Commission have been fantastic, and I think that seeing the community kind of consensus around this, as you said, the comments coming in, a lot of them were just minor, and so and even praise of the piece. And I think you see the same thing here, is we've just got some minor things, and the big stuff has been plowed through, so this is a plan to be proud of, I really think so. And like Marcus said, it will go through revisions, and that we can amend and amend and amend until we are blue in the face if we need to, but I don't know that that's gonna be as necessary. What it will do is it will at least start guiding and directing the decisions, these huge decisions that we currently are using such archaic visioning for, and to be able to move forward with this document on those types of decisions is just, will be transformative for the decision makers in this community and for the community as a whole. So I want to thank the boards for all the work you guys have done, all the reading. I mean, it's been hundreds of pages every time we get revisions, but it's been worth it. It's been a real good exercise, a real good learning opportunity. So thank you for all your time and your commitment to this, and certainly to the public for all the work that they've put into it, because they helped put in some work. So looking forward to hopefully getting this
put to bed next week. Mark, did you think of what you were gonna say, or?
Well, you did touch on a lot of that, but I think maybe adding to what you said, Mayor, I think the timing of this is, I think, just spot on here when we think about the work we're going to be doing with CDOT along the Santa Fe corridor. It is this comprehensive plan, it is the transportation master plan coupled with that really is going to give us a good conversation with CDOT and to make sure that we get our voice heard in that process. We're going to make some very long-term decisions in that corridor. So I think that's definitely great. The other thing too is that it puts staff and council in a much better position here as we pursue grant dollars. Once we have an updated comprehensive plan and we have a transportation master plan, Keith will be the first one to tell you we must have those in place in order for us to be competitive. So I think our timing is just wonderful.
There's one thing, it seems the transportation board, well, I know they're new, they have not been involved. We don't have them here tonight, they haven't been here at other meetings, and I know they're new, but I want to see them really get geared up and more involved. It seems to me they're being led and they're not leading. They need to be more involved.
I think, again, they are new. I think they're trying to get a little bit of footing underneath them, trying to understand kind of their charter. We did give them a charter on what their purpose is. I think Kathleen had, quite honestly, the best analogy. We're handing them the baton on the transportation master plan. They're going to take this much further.
They're not even warming up. I want to make sure they're warmed up and ready for that.
Let's get them stretching. Let's get them stretching out.
I'll interject on that as the staff liaison. Thursday night, they're doing their work plan for the next 16 months. Some people know about my thoughts on the timing of that transportation board, but basically,
What about the ones that
you
don't?
threw them in at the last minute.
Right.
And so they've all been involved, they've all.
But when you mentioned your plan, you said some know, but what, tell us that don't know.
Don't know what.
What you said some know your.
Timing of the.
So I would have preferred to stand this board up a year ago or after the plan was adopted.
That's
But
where we are.
not at the last minute.
Right.
And so that's caused a lot of issues within the board just because of the time sequencing. So now that the plan, they've provided comments in your packet tonight, and so their intent is to take the plan forward and to dive into this thing. And so Thursday night, they're gonna work on what does the next 16 months look for them, and what's their work plan gonna be, and how are they gonna tackle it.
I think they have a foundation to build on the plan.
Thursday evening, 6 or 6:30.
They have to meet at the
Yeah,
same.
because last time they met in the morning.
It's,
That's another story.
Yeah, they gotta be consistent.
well, trying to.
If only 5 people show up, what kind of meeting is that?
Here's the issue, is that when other people come onto boards and commissions, they have a standing meeting, which they've had for years. This is one of the few occasions when you're starting a new community commissioner board and you're kind of letting them pick the time. Like, one of the times they picked was opposite council, which is not legal under our code. You can't meet opposite you. So we've been trying to work through that with the individuals on the board. It's a very different circumstance than any other board where you know when it meets. So we're trying to work our way through that.
Good, yeah, I wanna see them have it.
Lesson learned, when we set up a new board, state a time and call it done.
Yeah, probably so.
Well, we had asked about doing that, but you guys wanted to talk to them. I think, once again, we've got a transportation mobility board. And nothing is ever easy the first shot out the gate, but we have the board, we've got solid people on it. Keith is leading it, we'll soon have a transportation mobility plan to work on. So we've got all this stuff now that we've talked about for years, so now we have it.
That's right.
And,
No, I'm glad we have it, no doubt about it.
get them going and start hearing things. All good. All right, if there's nothing else, we're adjourned. Thank you.
All right.